recap quickly while I find the Gemara online, since I'm in my office. And remember the discussion yesterday really revolved around three different categories of people who have to cut their hair as part of their purification process, right? A Nazir at the end of his or her days of Nazirut, a Mitzora at the end of their Tahara, and a Levi, which is a one-time in history event, but a thing that happened in the Midbar. The Levi is the one in which it says tar. It says use a razor, right? None of the other ones explicitly say that. And so the real question is, how do we know? And we said 2 days ago that, well, Nazir, we learn out tar potentially from Mitzora, right? Because Mitzora must need a razor, so too a Nazir. And the Gemara said you can't do that because Mitzora is more chamur, Nazir is more kal, you can't learn one from the other. And then we figured out that Nazir needs a razor according to one opinion because the pasuk says don't use a razor when you are a Nazir to cut off your hair. So we learned from that pasuk that when you're finished being a Nazir, you use that same razor to actually cut off your hair, right? It's the mirror image, essentially. And we learned it from a pasuk that was a couple of days ago. Yesterday we asked, right, how do we know about Mitzora? And we tried to prove it from the combination of the other two. And then the question we had that we're still dealing with is how do you know by a Mitzora? Why did 2 days ago we assumed a Mitzora needs a razor? We asked to learn Nazir from it. And yesterday we didn't know if Mitzora needs a razor and we tried to learn it from Nazir. So which one is it? And we said yesterday that in fact it depends on a different machloket, which is a machloket about a fourth person, which is a regular, well, it's true both by a Kohen and by Yisrael, that the Torah says that you're not supposed to cut off your beard, your pat zikenecha, right? The corner of your zakan, of your beard. And it says it both by a Kohen, it says it separately by everyone else. And the question was, what's that referring to? In what way can't you cut off your beard? So we had a machloket in the Mishnah in Makot between the Chachamim and Rebbe Eliezer, whether that Rebbe Eliezer said any way you cut it off, including the scissors or a tweezers or anything else. And the Chachamim said only a razor, right? The only prohibition of cutting off your beard is with a razor. And the Chachamim who had that opinion learned that essentially, or not learned that, but used the pasuk by Mitzora in that vein, right? Because the pasuk by Mitzora says, at the end of the days of your tzarat, cut off all your hair, which is a general thing, and then it starts enumerating which hair to cut off, right? Your hair on your head, the hair on your beard, your gabot einav, right? So it talks about cutting off different parts of your hair, I guess, or different places of your hair. And we asked in the Breita yesterday, why does it say cut off your beard? It says cut off all your hair. Of course you're going to cut off your beard, right? So basically what we concluded yesterday was that the reason the Torah had to say cut off your beard by a Mitzora is to tell you what if the Mitzora, right, you might have thought that the Mitzora shouldn't cut off their beard because the Torah separately says don't cut your beard, right? And therefore you would have thought, well, the Mitzora shouldn't cut off his beard. He could cut off everything else in his head and his body, but not his beard. And so therefore the Torah had to specifically say cut off your beard to tell you, even though there's a prohibition of cutting off your beard, you can do it by a Mitzora. And we prove from there that since according to the Chachamim, the only prohibition of cutting off your beard is using a razor, when the Torah says by a Mitzora, you're allowed to do it, it must be saying you can do it with a razor, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't need to permit it. If you can cut off your hair with the scissors, and that's not a prohibition, then obviously that's what you would assume. The fact that the Torah specifically says you're allowed to do it means that the way you did it would be over the prohibition of cutting off your beard. And the Torah is still saying you're allowed to do it. So that's how we prove that a Mitzora has to use a razor, according to the Chachamim. The one question we asked yesterday, which we're going to repeat today, is, well, maybe a Mitzora has options. Maybe a Mitzora can cut off their beard with the razor or a scissors. And the Torah is saying, even if you feel like doing it with a razor, it's fine, even though there's usually a prohibition. And we said that can't be the case. That was the last thing we said yesterday on the top of Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, that according to Reish Lakish, if there's an option to do, the Torah says do one thing and don't do something, and they seem to conflict, right? It says eat, and then it says don't eat or something. Then the ideal situation is you try to be mekayem both things, right? If you can be mekayem both things, you have to try to do that. So therefore, if the Torah had allowed for a Mitzora to cut off their beard in a way that wouldn't be over the prohibition of generally cutting off your beard, that would be the way you have to do it. The fact that there's a ability to be over the prohibition of cutting off your beard when you're a Mitzorah means that's the only way a Mitzorah can do it. And so that conclusion now is that a Mitzorah has to use a razor, according to the Chachamim. And that's why 2 days ago, we made the assumption a Mitzorah needs to do a razor. Let's conclude that a Nazir should be derived from a Mitzorah. Okay, that is where we were up to yesterday. That's my summary. Today's daf, Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, begins with the 5th line of Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, the Reb Eliezer, right? Now, Reb Eliezer, Reb Eliezer essentially says that when we say in the Torah, don't cut off your beard, it means don't cut off your beard with anything, right? In which case, the pasuk by Mitzorah clearly cannot be telling you that you need to use a razor with a Mitzorah, because any way you'd cut off your beard would be prohibited. Even if a Mitzorah was using a scissors or a tweezer, that would be a prohibition by any other person who's not a Mitzorah, and therefore the Torah has to permit it. But there's no conclusion from there that the Mitzorah has to use a razor. So ask the Gemara today, Reb Eliezer, 5th line from the top, end of the line, my taima. What's his source to know that a Mitzorah needs to use a razor? Says the Gemara, he learns it from a different word in the same pasuk. Because remember, the pasuk says, cut off all your hair, and then it says, et rosho, et zikano. We skipped the word rosho. We skipped the word your head, and we went to zakan. But Reb Eliezer learns it, yelef mi rosho. He learns it from the word in that pasuk when the Torah says by a Mitzorah, cut off all your hair, and cut off the hair on your head, right? So what's the chiddush? What's it adding? The Tanyas. The Brisa now speaks this out. Rosho. It says Rosho by a Mitzorah. Matam Lomer. What's that teaching us, right? It's teaching us that what if a Mitzorah is a Nazir, right? I'm sure everyone thought about this, right? This is the worst, this is the nightmare scenario, right? You say, I want to be a Nazir for the next 6 months, I don't know, or 3 or 1 month. And then God forbid you turn into a Mitzorah, right? Now you're very stuck, right? Because you can't, the only way to be finished from being a Mitzorah is to cut off your hair. But you're a Nazir, so you can't cut off your hair. But of course, the only way to finish your Nazirut would be to be Tahar from your Tzarat. And so since you can't get rid of your Tzarat, you can't get rid of your Nazirut, you're really stuck being Tameh and with a lot of hair and no wine for the rest of your life, right? You're in a lot of trouble. So that's a big problem, right? So you might have thought, Lifishanemer Gabi Nazir, Tar lo yavar al Rosho. Right? A Nazir cannot cut the hair on their head. So Yachal af Nazir Mitzorah Kain. You might think that applies even to a Nazir who's a Mitzorah, right? It doesn't matter which order, but let's just say you're first a Nazir and you become a Mitzorah. So Talmud Lomar, therefore the Torah says Rosho, right? The Torah says Rosho. And so what does Rosho tell you? That even though you're a Nazir, and the Torah says about a Nazir, Ta'ar lo yavar al Rosho, don't use a razor to cut the hair on your head. If you're a Mitzorah and you have to cut the hair in order to become Tahar, you're allowed to do it. Now, clearly, that has to only be a tar, right? It has to only be a razor, because the Torah explicitly says by Nazir, don't use a razor. So if it's saying by Mitzorah you can use it, it must be saying you can use the thing that's otherwise prohibited. Says the Gemara Mimai, how do you know that's for sure referring to a razor? Dilma, maybe it's saying, maybe by a Mitzorah, you in fact can cut off your hair or remove your hair with a tweezers or with a plane, and that would be fine. But what the Torah is telling you, so why does the Torah need to tell you that you can do it with a razor? Lememar, to tell you afilu b'tar, right? That you can even do it with a razor, meaning even if you have many ways, or let's say you don't have a tweezers available, all you have is a razor, that you're allowed to do that. Because I would have thought to say, Ho'il v'gabi Nazir, he avid b'tar mechayev, right? And maybe since a Nazir who cuts off their hair with a razor is chayav, so I would have thought if you're a Mitzorah who's a Nazir, gabi Mitzorah nami lechayev, and kamash malan delo, right? So maybe all the Torah is telling you is that a Mitzorah, this can't prove a Mitzorah has to use a razor. Maybe a Mitzorah could use a razor, but could also use a tweezer. And all the Torah is telling you is that even though you could use other things, if you choose to use a razor, it's okay. It's not a prohibition of being a Nazir. So maybe that's all it's telling you, not that you have to do it, but that you could do it. And we give the same answer we gave yesterday, which is why I said it over, right? It says the Gemara, because Isal Kedaita, where are we? It's around halfway. Isal Kedaita, if you're of the opinion that Ki Avid bin Malaketa Brehitzni Mitzvah Ka'avid, right? Then Midolo Kativ Tar in Kiresh Lakish. then you would have had to go like Reish Lakish, which we don't speak out, but we said yesterday, which is that when you have an option of doing a mitzvah and not being over the Avera along the way, you have to do it that way, right? And so if there was an option for a mitzora to cut off their hair without using a razor, then a mitzora Nazir would have to have used that option. And the fact that we allow basically a mitzora who's a Nazir to cut off their hair with a razor means that that's the only way a mitzora is allowed to cut off their hair. So according to now Rebbe Eliezer, we derive that a mitzora has to use a razor at the end of their tahara from this pasuk of Rosho. Okay, ask the Gemara, according to the Chachamim, who learned the same thing from the word zikano, what does the word Rosho tell you? Rabbanan, around 10 lines on the bottom, Hi Rosho, my darshibe. What do they do with the word Rosho? Says the Gemara, they need that for something else. If you recall, we haven't discussed this yet, there's another prohibition about cutting off your hair, right? It says, Lo takifu pa'at roshchem. Don't cut off, or don't, I don't know how to translate that in English, but don't make, the corners basically, right? I don't know how you translate, don't circle or something, the hair on your head. So you're not allowed to cut off all the hair on your head. Of course, practical implications of that we will discuss in Masechet Makot. But now the question is what's relevant for a mitzvah, right? So generally, a person is not supposed to be takifu pa'at roshchem. They're not supposed to leave just the corners, let's say, right? So, so you might have thought that that's a problem for a mitzvah. How could they cut off their hair, right? Titania. Now we're going to read a Braita which goes through that. It says in the pasuk, "Lo takifu pa'at roshchem." A regular person usually is not allowed to cut off the corners of their head, their hair, right, on the head. Yachlaf mitzorakein shouldn't cut off the corners of your head either.
That's what they say, corner of your head, actually, which is very weird. Yeah.
Fair enough. So don't cut off the hair on the corners of the head. Yachlaf mitzorakein, you might think that applies to mitzora, right? That a mitzora, at the end of their tzorah, the Torah says, cut off all your hair. Maybe it's saying, don't cut off the hair on your head, because there's a separate prohibition. Cut off your eyebrows, cut off your beard, cut off your other body hair. Maybe it's saying, don't cut off the hair on top of your head. Talmud Lomer, therefore the Torah explicitly says, Rosho, right? Talmud Lomer, Rosho. So therefore it says Rosho to tell you that even though elsewhere you're not supposed to cut off all the hair on your head, by a mitzvah, you're supposed to do that. So that's why the Chachamim need the word Rosho, and they need the word Zikano to tell you that a Kohen who's a Nazir, who's a mitzvah, can also cut off their beard, even though a Kohen usually cannot cut off their beard, at least certainly not with a razor. Ask the Gemara now, question that obviously lends itself. Why do you need both, right? Why do you say Lamali the Michtav Rosho, typically mizikno, right? Why we learned yesterday, and which we remember, that the word zikano already tells you that even though there's usually a prohibition of cutting off your beard, by mitzvah it's not a prohibition. So why can't you say the same thing, learn the same thing about your head, right? Your hair on your head. Tanya. Now we quote the Braita from yesterday. Zikano, my tamalomar. Why does it say zikano by mitzora? Since it says by a Kohen and also is true by Yisrael that you can't cut off your beard, or at least the corners of your beard. Yachlaf mitzora came. So you might think that applies to mitzora. Tamalomar zikano. So we said yesterday, according to Chachamim, that the pasuk zikano tells you can cut off your beard. So lamali the michtav rosho, lamali the michtav zikano. Why do we have to tell you that you're allowed to cut off the hair on your beard and you're allowed to cut off the hair on your head? They're both prohibitions. They're both permitted to a mitzvah. Tell me one and I'll learn the other, right? Says the Gemara, in fact, you need to tell me both of them. Look, let's say the Torah just said that a mitzvah cuts off all his hair, or her hair. Let's say him, it's easier for the zakan. He cuts off all his hair and he cuts off his beard. Right? But it doesn't say, and cut off the hair on your head. So in that case, if it had said Zikanov, Lakatav Rosho, Hava meaning, you know what I would have thought? That the reason that a Nazir, that a Mitzorah, can cut off the hair on their head is not because you're allowed to go against the prohibition of cutting off the hair of your head. I might think it's because Hava Mina Hakafat Kol Harosh Loshma Hakafa. Right? Recall that we had a whole discussion earlier, and we've had this several times, about whether cutting off the hair on your head means you can't cut off all the hair on your head, or you can't cut off and like a line, right, like a strip, where you cut off the side and you leave, as the Rambam says, as the priests would have, right, the Avodah Zarah, that they would cut off basically, they make a strip over here, right, and if you could see me, and leave a row essentially on the top of the head. So maybe the prohibition is not cutting off all your hair, right? And maybe a Mitzora who has to cut off all their hair is not over the prohibition. So the reason the Mitzora cuts off their hair is not because they're over they go against the commandment not of the Lotaseh of Lotakifu Patrushchem. It's because they're not being over Hakafa, because Hakafat Kol Harosh, cutting off the hair around the whole head, Loshma Hakafa. Therefore, Lahachi Katav Rachmana Rosho, therefore the Torah says also, don't cut off the hair, do cut off the hair on the top of your head to tell you, if I hadn't told you that, you wouldn't have done it, right? Because it is a prohibition, according to this Manda Amar, to cut off all the hair on your head. And now turn the page, Namal from the bed. The Katav Rachmana Rosho, below Katav Zikano, if it had just said, cut off all your hair and cut off the hair on your head, but not said, cut off the beard. Now, I would have known from there, right, that, okay, you cut off the top, the hair on your head, because even though there's generally a prohibition of cutting off your hair, you're allowed to do it in this case, right? But I would have thought, Hava Mina, Mashma, all right, so I would have thought that only implies Tarti. I would have thought that it's teaching you two different things, right? First of all, which is the basic principle that there's a commandment of a mitzora, cut off your hair, and that commandment overpowers is docha, the lotaseh of don't cut off the lo takifu pa'at roshchem. I would have thought that, but I would have also thought mashma. I would have known that kafat kol harosh shma kafa, right? I would have also known that I would have assumed that cutting off all the hair on your head is called hakafa, but I would not have known. So those are important rules, right? But what I wouldn't have known, va'akati bitar minalan, I wouldn't have known that a mitzora has to use a razor, right? Because remember that cutting off the hair on top of your head has nothing to do with a razor, right? It never says the word razor when it talks about pa'at roshchem lo takifu. Right? It just says don't make it a circle, basically. Don't cut off the hair on top of your head. And so therefore, had I only said Rosho, I would have learned that A, it's a prohibition to cut off the hair on your head. And even though it's a prohibition, we don't care. Mitzora, ati aseh of Mitzora and docha lo taseh of cutting off your hair. But I would not have learned that cutting off the beard of Mitzora has to be done, or not the beard, that all of the cutting of a Mitzora has to be done with a razor. I would have thought a Mitzora can use, remember, it doesn't say razor by Mitzora. So I would have not learned that a Mitzora needs a razor. How do I know that a Mitzora needs to have a razor? Because it says, no. It says, and cut off your beard. Now remember that the prohibition, according to the Chachamim, of cutting off your beard is only if you use a razor. And so the fact that the Torah now is to say a Mitzora is allowed to do it means that otherwise you would have thought the Mitzora can't do it, right? It must be because the Mitzora has to use a razor. And so therefore the Torah is telling you several things here. It's telling you that ati aseh v'dachi lo taseh, right? That the aseh of a Mitzora cutting off his hair or her hair is docha lo taseh of don't cutting off the hair on your head. And also that a Mitzora has to use a razor, and that's the only way a Mitzora can cut off their hair, right? And that means also, even though usually you can't use a razor to cut off your beard, a Mitzora is allowed to do it. And so now we know, according to the Chachamim, that a Mitzora has to use a razor. And the question 2 days ago was, can we derive Nazir from Mitzora because you're such an expert in this whole Gemara? And so that is where we conclude. Now, as the Gemara, since it's such a short daf, one other question. Reb Eliezer, the Ati Aseh v'dachi lo taseh minal. How does Reb Eliezer know that an Aseh is docha lo taseh? Now, this is a very problematic question. Because we just sort of said, I would say, well, one reason why, there's a lot of different ways to read this question, and I wouldn't tell you Tosfos' way, but the fundamental issue here, right, is that even though we already just said, this is Tosfos' sort of version, right, we sort of just said that according to Rebbe Eliezer, the fact that the Torah says the word Rosho tells you that even though usually you can't cut off all the hair on your head, you're allowed to do it by a Mitzora, right? And according to the Chachamim, the word Zikano tells you the same thing about a beard, right? So the reason, the challenge is, why are we saying, according to the Chachamim now, we know Aseh Docha Lo Taseh, because although you usually can't cut off your beard, now you're allowed to. According to Rebbe Eliezer, how do you know Aseh Docha Lo Taseh? Well, why don't we say we know it? Because Rebbe Eliezer said you can't cut off the hair on your head usually, and the Mitzora is allowed to. Right, so the aseh of Mitzora is docha lo taseh of not cutting off your hair. And so Tosha says the reason why we're asking the question going to Rabbi Eliezer is because if you recall, yes, as we said like 10 minutes ago, that Rabbi Eliezer uses Rosho to tell you about a Nazir who's a Mitzorah, right? Remember, he said if a Nazir is a Mitzorah, a Nazir is not allowed to cut off the hair on their head. It says Tar lo yavar al Rosho. By Mitzorah, it says cut off all your hair. How do I know that a Nazir who's a Mitzorah is allowed to cut off their hair? The thing about a Nazir and a Mitzorah, right, is that a Nazir, if you recall, has not just a lotase, don't cut off your hair, right, which is tar lo yavar al Rosho, don't cut off your hair with a razor, but a Nazir also has a mitzvah aseh, right? Gadol yiyah sarosho, right? Gadol parasarosho. Sorry, grow your hair effectively. So a Nazir has an aseh and a lotase, right? And what Rebbe Eliezer came along and did was said that the the mitzvah, the aseh of mitzorah, that cut your hair is stronger than the aseh and the lotase of the Nazir. Says Rabbeinu Tam, I think it is, or maybe the Rif actually, says Tosfot, that the question here is that if Rabbi Eliezer uses Nazir in Mitzorah to tell you that a Mitzorah who's a Nazir can cut off their hair, it must be because he already knows from somewhere else that Aseh is Docha Elotase. Because if he didn't know from somewhere else that Aseh is Docha Elotase, then how could you say from Mitzorah that it's telling you a Mitzorah cuts off their hair and is over an Aseh and a Lotase of Nazir? Maybe all it's telling you is that a Mitzorah can be over Lotase, right? That Aseh of Mitzorah can be Docha Elotase. The fact that he's using it for Nazir to tell you that the Aseh of Mitzorah is Docha Elotase and an Aseh means that there must be another source of Aseh Docha Elotase. So what is that other source? That's now the question, 2 lines from the bottom, which is also 5 lines from the top. Rabbi Eliezer, the Ati Aseh, the Dachi Lotase Menalei. How does he know in general that a mitzvah aseh can come and push off and override a mitzvah lotase? Yalef migidilim. He derives it as we had in the beginning of Mesechet Yevamot, pretty extensively. The mitzvah of tzitzit, right? Gidilim taseh lecha. The Torah says put strings, I guess is how we translate gidilim, or weaves on the corners of your baggage. Sorry, what was it?
Twisted cords.
There we go, somewhere in the middle. Twisted cords, gidilim, and that's a positive aseh, right? A mitzvah aseh. But as the Breita speaks out, the Tanya, I'll quote this Breita. It says, "Lo tovah shatnez," right? Don't wear shatnez. Of course, and the next words in the pasuk are gidilim taseh lecha, right? You can make gidilim for you. So the fact that the Torah juxtaposes those 2 commandments, one which is Lo tovah shatnez, don't wear shatnez, make woven, or whatever you said, strings on your corners. So what it's telling you is, ha gidilim taseh lecha mehem, that although you're not allowed to generally make shatnez, you can turn them into tzitzit.
For this.
And so this is a very explicit pasuk, which tells you that although there's a lo taseh, don't wear shatnez, if you remember, we've discussed this many times, if is pishtan and your tzitzit are tzemer, or tzitzit have to be tzemer, then you're allowed to put them together. And the Torah is explicitly saying, don't wear shatnez unless it's through gedilim. So the Torah is telling you a mitzvah aseh in general can be docha lo taseh. That is something Rebbe Eliezer previously knew, and Rebbe Eliezer therefore looked at this pasuk by Mitzorah to say, why is the Torah telling me that a Mitzorah can do this, even though I would have thought he couldn't do it? Because if the Mitzorah was a Nazir, and a Nazir has both a mitzvah aseh and a mitzvah lo taseh, not to cut off their hair, right? A mitzvah aseh to grow it, and a mitzvah lo taseh not to cut it. Even so, in the face of a Mitzorah, those are thrown out the window. And the mitzvah aseh of Mitzorah is docha the lo aseh and the aseh of a Nazir. And that is the end of that Gemara. We're going to stop here at the top of Membet Amud Aleph. And I thank you for coming out so early, those who came out.
Thank you.
I think David actually is doing it this week. So we'll pick it up from there tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Willie.
You're welcome. Shavua Tov and happy early Purim.
Shavua
Thank
Tov.
you. Enjoy your day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.